and welcome to episode 44 of the Virtual Velo Podcast with me, Emma Martin, and my co-host, Chris Schwenker. Well, before we get started today and introduce our guest, I just want to say how good it is, Chris, to have you back and so quickly, looking so well following that cardiac procedure. How are you?
Well, to tell you, I am really doing well, and I'm really happy to say that. I know I left off the last podcast with a lot of mixed emotions and a great deal of uncertainty, but the surgery was on June 6th, which is exactly 2 weeks ago. The day of the surgery was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And despite being humbled on several occasions during this process, I am progressing extremely well, thanks to my surgical team and the support of my family and loyal friends. The surgeon told me I shouldn't operate heavy machinery or sign any legal documents, so I think that we should be fine for today, Emma. But in all seriousness, I'm really excited to get back into the swing of things, and it's amazing to think that I first connected with our guest over 2 years ago, and that was when I came across his paper that he published in the International Journal of Esports. This was in early 2022. That was entitled "Zwift's Anti-Doping Policy: Is It Open to Cheating?" And this was the first work that I had come across that tackled the very controversial topic of cheating in esports and cycling esports, and groundbreaking in a lot of ways. And having looked at it again 2 years later, it's even more impactful, more groundbreaking to me. So I'm really looking forward to discussing it with him, seeing that we're still facing a lot of the same challenges and the necessity to address them as we get closer to perhaps Olympic recognition or the creation of the Olympic esports games.
Well, to our guest, and this is a guest I know Chris, as he's just mentioned in particular, has been looking forward to speaking to and meeting, well, not quite in real life, but over video conference facilities. He's been cited in the Zwift. He's a research associate at Newcastle University, and earlier this year was awarded his Ph.D. He has a powerlifting background and has competed internationally for Ireland. He has a sport and exercise science undergraduate and postgraduate degrees and has a healthy lifestyles and physical activities PhD. But we're not here to talk to Dr. Andrew Richardson about any of that. Well, we might get into a little bit. But he has a research interest into performance-enhancing drugs and cheating. Welcome, Andrew, Dr. Richardson, should I say. Welcome to the Virtual Velo Podcast. It's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you, guys. No, it's really, really great to be here. I've been a fan for the podcast for a while, and please just call me Andrew on it. And yes, with it, like from my research background, always opens up a question of how did I get into the whole esports scene and performance enhancing drugs away
you
from
have
the PhD.
My first question down to a T, Andrew. How did someone from powerlifting get interested in e-cycling?
Yeah, it's a very strange journey, but I think it's quite interesting personally. So I got into powerlifting, I'm going to say now 2012 going into 2013 from being injured far too many times playing rugby as a kid. And I was doing PE for my A level, and I got injured at Ulster Schools trials for playing rugby. And obviously my parents were a bit worried that I wouldn't be able to complete my PE A level because that was my main sport of choice. Then during the rehab and process with that, I just met a few friends who are at the gym, and they did the whole sport of powerlifting, and they said, "Oh, you are quite good at the whole training side." And I did all my athletics, swimming, rowing, all growing up throughout school. And for me, doing like the train, I was something I always enjoyed. And then once I just got into it, I was like, wow, I'm actually quite good at just moving objects in very, very specific planes of motion, so to speak. And then from that, the rest was history. Did that for 5-6 years. Set up a powerlifting club at Teesside University, won the Northern University Championships, represented my country on a couple of occasions, and the best I got there was at the World University Games in Minsk in Belarus in 2016, where I got third in the squat, third in the deadlift, and fifth overall. And then after that, I want to focus more on my education and learning. So that covers the first part of your question. But regarding the actual image and performance enhancing drugs or anabolic steroids, or androgenic anabolic steroids in terms of the correct term. Throughout all my time, from my A level through my undergraduate, my master's, and where I'm at now, I've always had an interest in working in gyms. So obviously the most common for a lot of people who do sports science, they would work in community sport or work in their local gym, and not just to build up your skills and your ability to coach and teach athletes. Now, whenever I was doing my level 2 gym instructor learning, and I was also competing at my last year in school, and I started to go to these competitions and whatnot, I started to notice there's a lot of big dudes here, like unnaturally big dudes. And then obviously my parents, who were they did quite well sport at then their youth, they obviously made me aware. Obviously, there's no pressure to make me aware of these drugs, to not use them. But the gyms I was training at and competing at, I started to see like the use of needles, obviously the behaviors like the acne on the backs and whatnot. My PE teachers at the time were like, they were very adamant, said you don't need to be going on this. So I had really good role models at a young age growing up. And then through that side, through the whole clean sport aspect, I wanted to learn more about anti-doping principles, understand what WADA is, UK anti-doping. And then at a few like the powerlifting events, I helped volunteer as a chaperone. So for people listening, the chaperone roles, whenever you would go and help the anti-doping testing team there. And you would go and you would find the athlete that's being required for testing, and you would essentially escort them to the room to then be tested and whatnot. And I've been a tested athlete myself many times as well. And then the more sort of got into, I started to realize this is really interesting in why people use drugs. But as I went over to then Teesside Uni for my undergraduate, my masters, started going to obviously the more public gyms, and obviously still competing in the powerlifting. I started going to gyms where there was just needles there, and it was quite dirty, unsanitary, and I had quite a lot of friends who would use drugs. And for me, it was like, well, that's their own choice, but I don't want to see you get, Hep B, Hep C, HIV, any cross contamination, any risk. But I can't stop you from using. Ideally, I want you to stop. So for me, it was like, well, what's the best way can I help out my own friends? And I was giving them the best education around it, bringing in clean bins and needles into these gyms as well. And then that led on to my master's research project, which I got 2 publications out of, and that was really interviewing people who use these drugs. And it was really on, so the first one being is the code of silence, how androgenic anabolic steroid users, they find it hard to talk to others who are not in their environment, not necessarily the people who don't use these drugs, but people who don't understand their culture in terms of all the hard work and training. And to bring up a quick example of that is one of the guys said, "Oh, it was easy to talk to you because you look like us, you train like us." And I was like, okay. And I said, well, what if I didn't? He said, well, if you're a skinny guy with glasses, I would have told you to just F off. And that was just his words. And I was like, okay, right, that's quite interesting. They're very protective of their own group, and they don't like how the media would portray them. And a lot of the steroid users that I would meet now, they would work in normal office jobs. Some of them work at unis, lecture, teach, do the research. But again, a lot of steroid users would get portrayed as these vain meatheads. So definitely the typology of the steroid user is changing. And then from that there, towards the end of my PhD in social policy, health inequalities, sedentary behaviours, I then took up a post in Northampton for 8 months, and I was working frontline needle exchange, so as a senior harm reduction worker. So again, helping create the assessment tools of how and why individuals would use, helping log in all the equipment they would use. And then from that, they collected quite a lot of information on them, recording with the using oral steroids, growth hormones, peptides, SARMs, anabolic steroids that being injectables, all the range of different types, heights, weights, blood pressures, grip strengths. So really a comprehensive profile to understand their risk factors. And for a lot of them, one of them, which prior to coming on down, one of my friends from the time doing the powerlifting over the years, and this just shows you like the code of silence in real time. So I'd interviewed him in the past, but then after our friendship, after 6-7 years, he then opened up more about his use and everything. And then this led to obviously one of the publications around I got big, but I couldn't get hard. and it was whole issues of using anabolics to obtain this masculine ideal, but then it destroyed his own. Actually, some may argue that what his meaning to actually be a man and whatnot, and he couldn't go to the NHS to get Viagra, whatnot as well. And then he let him do some very extreme, risky behaviors and whatnot. So again, this is obviously very extreme risk clientele I was working with it. So, and I've always just had a fascination with that side of image and performance enhancing drug users.
Andrew, it's a really interesting move, though, isn't it? From growing up and working as a weightlifter in that environment in gyms, that code of silence, that proliferation of performance enhancing drugs, to then looking at something that people do in their own homes, which is e-cycling. It's not a gym, it's not a social culture, it's not a social environment where there are groups and cultural norms. It's something that is done individually at home. So talk to us a little bit about the types of cheating, the types of doping that you might see in a very different environment.
Yeah, so I'll just give a little quick prelude to that there in terms of how I got into the esports side. I think that'll help listeners on the podcast. So as many people would agree, during COVID, it was a very different time for everyone. And obviously for me and a few of my colleagues, a lot of our research priorities changed and whatnot. So some projects were called off and whatnot. And the one thing I obviously always had an interest in was esports and playing games. I've always played games my whole life. I've had an Xbox ever since I was a kid and whatnot. But for me, I never ever thought about doing research in it. It was only from middle of 2020. And that came about with a few of my colleagues under the research papers, Philip Smith and Nicholas Berger. They're obviously very keen cyclists in their own right, but they knew my interest in obviously esports, and then that came about where we created this whole questionnaire, and then we shared it and collected all the data on it in 2021, which then spawned the first paper into Zwift's anti-doping policy. And how that came about, that was never the intention of the questionnaire. What came about was that whenever we're reading all the data that people were coming in, and then I then looked at their anti-doping policy, I was just thinking, as someone as an objective outsider, someone who plays games but understands anti-doping and the behaviors of why someone may want to cheat, I just found it quite an easy thing to cheat on without having any sort of previous knowledge of cycling with it. I thought there's a lot of ways to do it, and the more I just kept looking into it, more ways just kept appearing, and then hence how that spawned that academic piece of work.
It's really interesting that you say that as an outsider, not necessarily a cyclist that was involved in virtual cycling, because there are a number of statements that you made in the paper that were some very bold statements, and I'm going to read a couple to you here, and then I want you just to give me your insight as to what you were thinking back then. All right. You say, due to significant limitations to the policy and a lackadaisical anti-cheating culture, Zwift falls short when it comes to protecting the health and safety of riders, not to mention ensuring fairness and integrity across all cycling esports events. That's one. The next one is even more so. Zwift's anti-doping policy and its vulnerabilities to cheating and doping create a dopogenic environment for the esports community, one that allows rather than encourages doping practices. Can you just tell me what you mean by that? And, you obviously point to what you thought back then, 2.5 years ago, was a cheating culture. Why did you think that was the case then? And how do you think it is now?
Okay, so answering the first point, Chris, whenever going through it, there just wasn't enough rules or pit stops to either prevent someone from cheating or to actively dissuade someone to cheat on the platform. And I don't think this is just a Zwift issue. I think this is e-cycling and the esports issue itself, that there's not enough strong punishments out there. There's no one taking the lead and actually making really strong rules on this and saying if you're caught cheating by whatever means, you should be banned outright. That's the first thing. And since that publication, correct me if I'm wrong, but last time I checked, they still haven't updated anything from the Zwift anti-doping policy as well in terms of it. And so I find that quite surprising, considering we almost gave them like all the homework, where they say here these all the things. It wasn't for us to call them out and say you guys aren't doing a good enough job. It was like, here, we are all passionate about the sport, we think it's really good, but these are some gaping holes in your system here, and then that's why we create a list of recommendations in it for them to then follow and then to act. Hence why we create in it our own version of the WADA's anti-doping rule violations, the digital doping rule violations, so then they can literally copy and paste it and follow, and then any other esports game, team, or platform can follow on from that. Going on to your second point, now, whenever we then looked at obviously the questionnaire data, asking obviously people what they think of it, there's definitely a really strong perception from the community that there is a lot of people who would cheat on the platform. I believe it was 44% of the participants came out and said that we have experienced cheating in some way, shape, or form, whatnot. And again, that's not only just by our own piece of work. Bryce Dyer and Taylor 2023, they then published their own piece of work that was specifically looking at height and weight doping on the platform as well. And then I believe it was September, October last year, we had the first case of a e-cyclist competing in a in-person live event who was caught using a performance-enhancing drug, and they were only caught because they competed in a live in-person event, which then sort of opens up the question, is there other people who are going to be doping and using drugs at their home? And you're going to have more instances of cheating, Ph.D. use potentially at those earlier qualification rounds when there's less oversight compared to obviously the live in-person events where they're going to have hundreds of cameras on them, like the whole teams around them, and obviously thousands of people online, the streams watching them as well. So it does become harder to cheat at those events, and that's where the likes of the verification, like the sort of like creation of a digital biological passport becomes more into play going into these events, but there needs to be more proactive and more openness that they are doing more random drug testing as well to keep in line with like obviously like as a traditional cycling and other sports as well, especially with the announcement of the Olympic Games for esports.
I'm just going to do a really quick run through, if you don't mind, Andrew, and just pull a few things out of the papers just for our listeners if they haven't picked up on your work. And please do pick up on Andrew's work and the work followed up from that. Chris, I know the Communique has published a number of pieces as well around this area, citing some of the work Andrew's done. But different types of cheating and doping within e-cycling. I mean, you've talked about your background with performance-enhancing drugs, but digital doping, height and weight, gender doping, sandbagging, peddling styles, controller modification, calibration hacking, hardware modifications, software modifications, as well as performance-enhancing drugs. I mean, it's a very complicated thing to policy and police.
Yeah, it really is. And just to throw a span in the works and to be that there guy, and there's another paper I've got in review at the minute. It's updating Jan and Randall's 2006 paper, which is the first systematic classification in cheating in video games, where I've updated that, and they originally had 15 different classifications of cheating. I've now got to 20 with 53 different terms of different ways people can cheat in esports and video games. And there's other ways people can cheat too. That doesn't even have to be on the actual bike. If we're using e-cycling as the example, you can have people which would do geo filtering, which is they would deliberately slow down a server if you're from a different country. So your traffic becomes slower, therefore your opponent has an advantage. You've got people which would attack the servers as well. You've got people who go obviously like aim bots and trigger bots. They're more for like the games you would obviously shooting involved and whatnot. But again, people are now using AI to mask those bots. So it's like using anabolic steroids, but a masking agent to then cover that as
in
well.
A digital world.
Yeah. It's the rate of it, and I think it's because there's so much money now in it. And you've got people who would pretend to be other players. People would bring in a ringer and whatnot, but not show off the camera who the player is. That's where the verification issues become more and more important with it. Match fixing, throwing away games is obviously a huge risk in esports as well. And obviously, again, in terms of the governance issues, it then becomes even more of an issue in terms of where in the world's being played by their country's laws, because some laws are more stricter than others when it comes to cheating, doping, and hacking. And depending on where the Olympics is going to be hosted, and I can definitely see e-cycling being like one of the premier sports at it, if not the premier sport at, because it represents the Olympic values very, very well. It's a sport where it replicates an actual Olympic sport again too, but also it's not a sport that requires any sort of violence or any of those things. It's not in the Olympic spirit, and that's been made very clear by the IOC. They're not going to have likes of Call of Duty or any sort of game which involves shooting in it and whatnot, which obviously to more traditional esports and gamers, they don't really see e-cycling and, some of the other sports that was advertised at the Singapore Games as meeting their category of esports.
Moving on to the second paper that you wrote on the topic, which was called Perceptions of Cheating and Doping in E-Cycling. And you kind of alluded to it earlier that you polled, I think it was over 1,100 respondents that were virtual cyclists, and we tried to push that questionnaire out there for you. And a majority, 44%, said that they had experienced cheating in virtual cycling competition. But then you went on to ask them how many of them weight doped, and only a very small number admitted to weight doping. Now, we can probably all agree, I mean, you can probably agree that weight doping is the easiest way to cheat on virtual cycling, right? So the numbers don't kind of add up, right? If the majority of people think that they've experienced cheating, but only a small number of them weight dope, is it more of a perception than a reality? And the reason why I'm asking that is that I often think about if we were able to turn back the clock, and when we were doing our outlaw racing on Zwift, and Zwift was kind of not acknowledging that racing was going on because they didn't think that they really wanted to have that identity. So there was no real regulation going on. But because of that, we developed this stigma that all virtual cycling competition is a bunch of cheaters and weight dopers. Right? If that would have been policed in the beginning and that stigma never occurred, would our sport be much further down the road than it is now? I know it's an unfair question to ask, Dr. Richardson, but what is your impression of that?
No, I don't think it's an unfair question at all. I think as well, for Zwift's own credit, they could never have predicted how popular the sport would have been. And I would even argue COVID helped that as well, in terms of especially, getting more people active, getting people communicating with everyone, which is really good, and keeping clubs and teams going. But for them, obviously, the aim was to get people cycling active from communities, and then racing then became a bigger part of it. And obviously, you're always going to play catch up when it comes to people who are going to cheat and dope. That's why WADA is never going to be ahead of people who cheat and dope. And you can always put rules in place, and the vast majority of people are going to come into sport with good morals, good intentions, and whatnot. However, if you're like me and you've played online gaming at any sort of level, there is a group of people that will come online just to cause chaos, and they're there just to spoil the fun for everyone else, regardless of what happens. If their account gets banned or not, they'll just go create a brand new one. Now, obviously, comparing the two numbers you said, yes, obviously we look at that at face value. I think it was less than a couple of percent that admitted, or even it was less than 1%, that actually did the weight dope versus people experienced 44% of cheating. But then that's, as we said earlier, that's only one type of way to cheat and whatnot. So again, it could be other ways, or it could be perhaps that they feel like people are, they're doing the peddling the cheating methods such as the sandbagging, whatnot, or they feel like other people are, they are misrepresenting their actual avatars. They may know who they are in person, maybe changing their actual height, whatnot, or they may have some bots or devices in game that's giving them an unfair advantage. Because again, there's no way for us to go through every single person's race file see work out, was there someone who actually cheated. This is just their subjective opinion on whatnot on it. Again, this is just us reporting back what we find from the actual community's opinions and views.
So this is really important because of the legitimacy of e-cycling and the legitimacy of racing on these platforms. And it's something that I was about to say that everyone should be taking seriously. But who is responsible for this? Is it the individual racers? Is it the teams who have got teams involved in elite racing? Or is it the platforms? Or does it go even further than that in terms of, you talk about WADA, there's the UCI in terms of the governance of cycling, but then there are also esports governance organisations as well. Who is responsible for this, and where does different levels of responsibility lie?
So this is the golden question right here. And firstly, going back to some of your previous episodes we had, Dr. George Gilbert on, I very much support what he's doing. And that question he asked, what if e-cycling, he can win a gold medal at the Olympics? That's something I believe in too. And I would support him in that idea. And I hope more people do as well. But this comes down to everyone has a stake in it, and there can't be anyone just left out. But it's different when you look at traditional sports versus esports because of who owns the actual monopolies and control over the games themselves, really. So if we look at it from an individual point of view and say all the onus lies on the individual, it's like, well, you can't really do that, because if you look at like any sort of sport out there, like being traditional or esports gaming and whatnot, there's always going to be a few people who are going to spoil the fun. That there always will be a small amount, with that, irrespective of sport. And cycling, obviously, in its history, there's been plenty of cases of people who have cheated and doped and whatnot. We then take it to obviously the national governing bodies and the federations for the actual sports. They obviously have a greater say on it, and there needs to be a consistency in terms of the rules, the punishments, the bans out there. And again, and so another piece of work we're working on, we're sort of looking at, and in the last paper, the perceptions of cheating and doping, we asked, the cyclists, should bans translate from in-person cycling to esports? And again, that was quite a mixed answer, which we were quite surprised. We thought more people would have seen it. But again, we think this is because it's a very traditionalist view when it comes to cycling. A lot of the more, I would term, hardcore in-person cycling participants wouldn't view e-cycling as a sport. But then there's obviously such a huge community of e-cycling people who would view it as a sport. So you've also got two different camps arguing over these rules. Then when you take it a step further again, look, okay, well, what's like all the international bodies, like the governance aspect of it? Well, it's kind of like, well, with World Anti-Doping Agency, it's only got one esport federation on its code signatory, but in that they don't have a say in e-cycling. That's the first thing. That's International Esports Federation. None of the other esport international federations have anything to do with e-cycling itself. But then the likes of Zwift, MyWish, and other platforms, they're not doing any work from what I can gather with WADA itself. And WADA, in its own 2020 to 2024 plan, hasn't said anything about esports or e-cycling in it. And I think from the Paris Games, whenever they have this session on esports, we're going to start to find more information out. But it's a very, very murky area. It's the Wild West of sport at the minute, and everyone's trying to work out, okay, who takes the reins? Because then it comes back to the actual game platform themselves, because the game platforms own the rights of where it's shown, how it's shown, where it's going to be played and whatnot. And that's why I love esports, traditional games. They own the rights to all this, so it's very hard to have an external body controlling it or have an actual say in it, compared to traditional sports. You would have a broadcasting right for the viewing and various sponsors for certain things. So it's a very strange time to be in, but it makes it very interesting for obviously our roles reporting on it and doing the research.
Yeah, so you mentioned in the manuscript that you were nice enough to forward to M&I on the paper that you're writing now, that cycling esports gets the greatest scrutiny because it's the sport that most likely has the opportunity to be in the Olympics. And we heard last week that the IOC is making plans to meet in Paris about finalizing the Olympic esports games. I've debated, I'm sure you've heard on the podcast, whether cycling esports even needs the IOC or the UCI. Right? As an authority in the area, what would be your ideal model for cycling esports, governance-wise?
That's a great question. So for me, it would be, regardless of the platform, as in if it's Zwift or MyWish. I know in the podcast you've talked about it, and obviously there's some political elements to this with obviously MyWish, the funding around it, and then you've got, obviously, as you would be aware, and some of your listeners too, that the Saudi Arabian government, they're also creating the first esports city in Doha, I believe it's called. And then with that there, again, we don't know how that's going to play with obviously all the esports communities out there. So irrespective of the actual platform, everyone's going to know this is the e-cycling, this is the events, this is the actual type of races. For me, it's going to be around okay, is WADA going to have a say in it? Or is it going to be like sort of the ESIC, which is the Esports Integrity Commission, which they seem to be the equivalent of WADA. But again, they don't follow WADA's prohibited list. they follow their own privilege list, but they're more focused on with another aspect of cheating in esports, which is like the match fixing, the betting, the gambling side, which is a huge feature within esports. And for listeners on the call, if you aren't aware, you can walk into most bookmakers shops in the UK and bet on esports games as well. So that's just how much it's changed. So with it, it's going to become who's going to test it, who's going to set the rules on it, and then is it going to be supported by the IOC? If it's supported by the IOC as a sport, then it would likely be WADA getting involved, because how WADA tests every single sport, then that comes down to what the host country. So let's just use Paris in terms of France as the example. It'll be the French. Obviously, it'll be French doping authorities working with obviously other agencies to come in to help with the workload, the actual testing. And then I imagine there will be a live event, and there'll be obviously some qualifiers leading up to that. But for them, it'll be, I would say, follow the model of the UCI, how they have got a systematic rule book that covers all different disciplines of cycling. That would help, obviously, no pun intended, clean up the sport in a sense, and show that, okay, we're doing all this here, we're all following it. And that's something not only e-cycling can follow, but obviously all esports can follow as well. And you do have, there's just a lot of multiple challenges with it. And it's really going to be, I think, trial and error leading up to these esports games to see which is the best way to represent the community, the interested parties who run the events, the people who are going to be doing the actual testing at it, and then the overall Olympic Committee and the governance of the host nation. Because again, the actual laws in that country will be applied as well. Because again, they may have less stricter rules when it comes to bans and whatnot. And since there is no actual quantity or a shared punishment list across different esport platforms and different e-cycling platforms, it makes it quite hard to regulate, because one person can get banned and jump onto the next one under a different account and name if they wanted to.
So when I interviewed David Lepartien, the president of the UCI, when I was in Abu Dhabi, he told me that there will be an Olympic esports games in 2025 and cycling esports would be highlighted prominently. Are you under the impression that this problem will be solved, or will there be a model in place prior to those games in 2025 if they are held?
If they happen to have it done by then, I would be very impressed. I'd be shocked, to be honest. Yeah.
So can I just pick up, because some of the recommendations around how and what you need to do to stop doping and cheating in e-cycling. So there's the performance enhancing drugs element, which is about testing. Mm-hmm. There's then things in terms of dealing with the digital elements. So live streaming, which is becoming more and more popular even in community events, dual recording, named equipment with variances being allocated, in real life events, pre-performance, pre-race performance verification, post-race performance verification, random testing. We've seen some of the platforms calling riders in who are setting power elements outside of what's considered normal boundaries to actually test them in real life. And also, we're getting to a level now where we're starting to see the introduction of real-time flagging of discrepancies in performance. What else needs to be done? What are there any other key areas that you or the team you work with would recommend need to be in place? Or do we know what we need to do? We just now need to do it.
Thank you, Emma, for that really, really good summary of all the different things, both mechanical, physical, and digital, all there. So I think they've got the tools. I think they need to create a verification digital athlete biological passport that all platforms can follow and use, and that way this can be replicated across platform, irrespective of which one ends up getting the Olympic Games or the UCI contracts for the World Championship events. So you got people coming in where they do, let's say, biometric fingerprints. They obviously link up their heart rates. They link up the obviously something, a device in the heart rate monitor or something they wear, which measures your temperature, for example. Again, these are no means things that I would be saying this must go in. And then combined with that, it links up with your rider profile, all your logged workouts, they're your tested workouts that have been verified by the actual host and whatnot. And that way we've got this platform of data to back it up and follow going on through. And there has been like a couple of research papers, which I did go into, looking at how they're now starting to come and recommend that needs to be this, like the power outputs, the wattages, and other timed rides to act as this evidence base for the athletes profile going on. So I think it needs to be a collaborative effort covering all aspects, and in that way, as the technology improves, we can obviously reduce the likelihood and incidence of people cheating. But again, it has to be stronger deterrence in place to stop people thinking they can get away with it in the first place. But we are making the right track in that. I just think there needs to be a digital biological passport that covers all platforms, which everyone then uses.
I think that one of the themes that's come out here, and it's the reason why we haven't got a hold of this problem a long time ago, is that it's so complicated. There are so many factors involved, right? It's not just an athlete taking drugs, right? It's not an athlete interacting with the environment. The hardware is the environment, and then that environment then needs to be transferred digitally to a metaverse, which isn't even really an environment, right? Like Emma, we should say that we're going to have the trainer homologation group from Purdue on and for the next podcast to talk about their standardization protocol that they're working on the UCI with. But there are so many factors involved that it almost seems like it's a code that's impossible to crack. But in order for us to move forward, we have to come up with something, right? We have to figure something out. And one of the reasons why I choose to highlight your work, Dr. Richardson, is because we need more of it. I'm flattered when you cite the work that I do in your papers, but that only means that there aren't like real people doing the work that I'm doing. I'm not a PhD or an expert in the area. I really commend you for what you're doing, and I appreciate all the work that you put into it. And what can we do to get more of this? And what is the next step in the phase of the evolution of the academic experimentation and research in the sport?
So I think it's like whenever you view e-cycling as a whole, if we take a step back, if you go back 10 odd years, I don't think anyone would have sort of predicted this is where we're at. It's going to be going into a potential Olympic Games now. One of e-cycling is going to be probably the premier sport. I would put my name. It would be the forefront of the esports at the games in terms of like the popularity and whatnot, and how it's obviously will be very popular not just for fans and obviously us watching it, but traditional cyclists. It's something they can transfer over to and from. I don't know which we are seeing in real time. I think with it, it's like the more we do it, I kind of view it as this is what when WADA was starting to be created, the 60s, 70s, when people were starting to cheat in the Olympic Games in various sports, and we're at that similar timeline, not just in e-cycling, as an example, but esports as a whole. I mean, it is the Wild West out there, and people are still trying to work out. I mean, in esports, for people listening, obviously the use of performance-enhancing drugs in terms of anabolics, EPO, won't be the main drug of choice. It'll be obviously your stimulant-type drugs such as Adderall, Ritalin, and for them, there's a huge number of the gaming community which are neurodivergent, which are on prescribed medications of these drugs. But then there is, again, this perception that going on these drugs will make them better gamers as well. And there's other research out there which are doing similar work as what me, Dr. Nicholas Berger and Philip Smith are doing, where they've looked at a range of esports games and they have the same perception that everyone is on these drugs as well, and there's very little anti-doping education, very little risk awareness, very little harm reduction advice in it, and it's just part of the culture. And then as a side issue, there's issue around energy drinks being obviously huge sponsors at esports games, and they obviously have like a public health risk too, particularly in the UK. They've been in the news quite a lot recently as well. So there's many different aspects, and since there's no one policing it, becomes an issue. And a lot of esports, they don't want to be viewed as traditional sports, so they want to move away from the sporting model and having the same governance styles and the same formulas following. They want to be their own thing, and then it comes down to not only the players and the community want to say that they want to have things to actually change, but then you want to have the actual games, and those are stakeholders that come and say, we need to clean up our actual sport. And then you just had, it was back in March there, a couple of leagues in Vietnam, the entire league is being banned for match fixing. So again, it's just, this isn't just happening in one specific esport or e-cycling, it's every type of game. And I think it's because we can see it more because there's a digital footprint, there's evidence of it, and it's just out there more and more, and more kids are playing these games now. And it's just there. And I think for us, we can be quite critical of e-cycling, but I think that's not to put it in a bad light. It's because we want to see it do well, and we know the projection and the actual trajectory it can go. It can go really far, and if we get things right early on, we can obviously eliminate these issues early on, and it can be used as a good model for other esports to follow and say, look at how we have cleaned up the virtual environment by putting these measures in place.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think, if I sort of try and pull together the conversation today, the key components are there. They just need to be enacted and they need to be pushed through. And then there needs to be adherence to that governance and that regulation. And I think it's about a new discipline, isn't it? It's a new discipline of cycling that has come up through the digital world in a way very, very quickly, like you've talked about, Andrew, particularly with that rise in COVID, particularly then, this discipline of e-cycling very, very quickly has come to prominence and to the forefront of physical esport. Which is a fantastic way to be. E-cycling is a leading light in that new whole discipline of esports and physical esports. But then there's the catching up to do, isn't there? There's the education and advice to young people. There's education and advice to the community. There's highlighting. One thing for me, I think really you've highlighted the importance of the fact that a sporting governing body needs to be involved. I have a background that I have been team manager and team coach for regional youth mountain bike competitions, and every single event, whether it's been European or UK, there has been an educational path to the event we have taken those young riders to, very often around performance enhancing drugs and that whole agenda. And actually what we're saying now is that educational agenda for young people in the community now needs to be uplifted to include this digital element as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely with that, Emma. So I would even say with it, it's not only just to even highlight to them that, that you're more likely to be cheated out or anything. It's just to show them that, if these are instances where people have cheated in the past, but they've all been punished from it. And it isn't sort of to name and shame people. It's to show that we have a set of rules here. We're enforcing these rules, and this is to encourage sportsmanship, fair play. It's good ethics, and we want to have the best possible competition, not just for the athlete's point of view, but athlete health, well-being, safety, but as for fans as well. It makes good sport. It's entertaining for us to watch and whatnot with it.
I think I'm going to stop you there, Andrew, because I think that is a fantastic place to finish. We all want to watch good sport. We all want to play good sport, and we want the rules governing the sport to be adhered to.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. So, fantastic to have you join us today, Andrew. Thank you ever so much for giving up your time and for coming to chat to us on the Virtual Velo podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks
guys
so much,
for
Andrew.
having me on. Thank you.
Well, Chris, that interview with Andrew Richardson, really interesting around the legitimisation of e-cycling and issues around cheating and doping. Now, those studies of his, that first paper over 2.5 years ago now, and moving on swiftly and really key for the future of the sport.
Yeah, it is interesting to be able to kind of look back with the benefit of hindsight and see where we were back then. That paper was really groundbreaking, and I didn't know it at the time, but some of the things have been almost like he had a crystal ball. But moving on, there are some really interesting things going on in the sport now, that came across my desk today.
Yeah, there are. Things are moving swiftly, should I say, or should we say things are moving Zwiftly? Because today the announcement of the Elite Racers programme for 24-25, the Zwift Elite Community Racebook, was sent through to you today, Chris, wasn't it?
Not only me, but all the racers and the teams and everybody who's in the know is going to know a little bit more after we're through here. We're going to really break it down. But before we do, I just want to take the opportunity to thank a few people from the community and the platforms also that we're going to be speaking about. The last couple of weeks have been challenging to say the least for myself and my family, and it's times like these when you really come to appreciate the friends and even these people that you just meet virtually and never met in real life. And I'm speaking specifically of my Dirt Zwift team. The Riding Dirty crew and my team, the OGs, they raised a significant amount of money to, really help out my wife and I with a lot of comfort things and making the transition significantly easier for us. and it means a lot. And I'm doing really well, and I owe a debt of gratitude to them for that. I mean, also the platforms. I received a really nice care package from Zwift. I know that was initiated by James Bailey, and wanted to thank him and Chris Snook, and a personal message from Eric Min, which is really meant a lot. And the team over at MyWish, I was getting daily messages from Matt Smithson of encouragement and asking me how I was. And the team over there is so accommodating with the work that I do. And Indy Velo, Dr. George Gilbert could really empathize, because he's an open heart surgery survivor also, and he gave me a lot of great advice. And a lot of it was to just be easy on myself, which is not always the easiest thing for me to do. But I just want to take the opportunity to thank people for just making a huge difference in my life over the past 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, when communities come together, and the virtual community is indeed a real community and does pull together at times like this, Chris. So we're all so pleased you are back up and running. And whereas I took the approach of leaving you alone to get ready and back on your feet, but great to see you. As I said at the beginning of the show, you are looking so well, and I'm amazed at what you've achieved in 2 weeks post-surgery.
The doctor said I could walk, so I walked 7.5 miles. No, it is. I'm doing my best to get back to being me, and so that I can give back to everybody that's given me so much over these last couple of weeks. But it's also so that I can do these things. And our goal was to get back to do this. And beginning of this week, I didn't think it was going to happen, but it is happening. And the timing is right, because we have some exciting things to break down. And there's a lot of information, Emma. So why don't we get started?
Yeah, well, why don't we? Because this Zwift Elite Community Racebook that came out today for the 24-25 season, the season is going to consist of two major blocks. The new Zwift World Series, which sort of represents the regular season of racing, and the Zwift Games, which will continue to serve as a season-ending championships. And those two are now inextricably linked in this handbook, and lots of changes coming through, and changes that have come from the community and the racers themselves, and some great adjustments to what's going on for the 24-25 season.
Yeah, it's actually pulling in the community portion of this is something that the racers and the community side of the the Zwift platform and the competitive side of it has really been asking for, and it shows that they've been listening. So they're creating a season-long pathway into elite racing with open, democratic access to all events for all Zwift riders and teams, and supporting community and the organizers. So the first block, as you said, is going to be the Zwift World Series. So there'll be 5 races beginning in September and ending in January. And that'll be like the regular season to get ready for the playoffs, which will be the Zwift Games. And that's going to be a little bit later in the season. But each race will have a community open qualifier 2 weeks before. So anybody in the community that meets the eligibility criteria can then, try to qualify for the race, which is pretty amazing. The fact that they're going to have races every 2 weeks will allow us to remain engaged throughout the whole entire season, be able to create storylines, which, Sai and myself have always mentioned was one of the things that was really lacking in previous seasons, is that you never got to know the racers. There was no rivalries. There was no real connection or humanization. And with it being more regular, that's definitely going to be something that we're able to do here. Having the men's and the women's races back to back on the same day is the same, also along the same lines, having an equal footing there. So the excitement maintained. So if you're watching the men's race, then you're going to be glued to watch the women's race, because, you saw how enthralling the men's race was, and vice versa. And there'll be a community race for just regular Joe Schmoes like me that will be on the same course each week. So everybody that's racing on Zwift will have a vested interest in what is going on there.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, isn't it, Chris? You meant to smaller fields, 50 riders on the start line in the men's, 50 riders on the start line in the women's. And the top 8 men's teams and the top 8 women's teams from the Zwift Grand Prix in 23-24 are going to be able to award 3 specific riders from their teams with a series pass, which will give 24 riders on the start line for the women and 24 riders on the start line for the men. The other slots are open to those qualification races.
Which I think is incredible. It really is incredible. First of all, the smaller fields is something that we've been clamoring for forever, right? It's so incredibly difficult to keep track of what's going on with the field sizes that are so big. And I know the racers don't like it either because it's really ends up being more of a crapshoot than anything else on positioning where you are. So I think that the moves will have a greater impact because there'll be fewer racers. You'll have to really be tactical about the way that you do things, and you'll be able to learn the racers and what they're doing and how they race and how the teams are working together. I think that's a significant improvement.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because on those qualification races, you qualify for the specific race that is 2 weeks later, unless in that race you finish in the top 10 or you win any of the primes, then you will be awarded a season's pass and you won't have to go through the qualification process again. But each week or each time round, there is an open qualification process. Though anybody picking up a series pass along the way, that qualification slots obviously then become less than the original 26 it starts with.
Which is another way to build a storyline, right? Because
Yeah.
the racers that are doing really well are going to be in more of the races, which allows you to see them. They're more visible, they're more active. You're getting to learn them. I think it's a really, really hugely popular and great way to gain popularity of the sport and of Zwift and the way that they're doing things. And so is the prize purse. There's a pretty significant prize purse for all of these races, which is going to create an incentive that really wasn't there during the elite season last year. So each men's and women's race in the Zwift World Series will have an individual prize pot based on riders' positions at the finish line and a team prize for the best performing team. So during the races 1 through 4, we'll award bonus prizes at 2 preem locations as well. So there's approximately $10,000 per race, and that will be awarded 10 deep payout at the line. So that's pretty significant payout along the way there.
And I think the other incentive really is the fact that the series-wide classification will be about qualification for the Zwift Games. So the Zwift Games, you no longer have open qualification system for the Zwift Games in 2025. The primary means of qualification for those games will be through the Zwift World Series. And the series will have a points system. So an overall series points up to the top 50 of those riders will progress and gain qualification to the Zwift Games. So incentive to be in the mix, an incentive to ride each of the rounds as well, Chris, because points will put you in that series points list. It'll put you in the top 50, which then gives you qualification to the Zwift Games.
And it also will be eligible for the Zwift World Series ranking, which is basically just like a GC-based type of ranking system for another incentive, another payout. That's also a 10 deep prize purse that starts off with $3,000. That's there's the opportunity to make a decent amount of money for what the racers do, but it keeps them engaged. It keeps them engaged across the whole entire series, which is something that went towards the end of the season last year and into the Zwift Games Championship. There were a lot of racers that didn't show up because there really wasn't an incentive there for them.
Well, it's a big commitment, isn't it, from September through to January and then the Zwift Games in March. So it really is about planning. But also the other thing that I really like that's within the document is the recognition for the elite community racers in-game. That tick by the side of your name. They're launching a new system where the elite racers can gain eligibility criteria to be awarded a verified badge in-game so that when they are riding on Zwift, the community knows who they are and they know that that person they are riding with or is riding on the same course as them is indeed one of the elite Zwift racers.
This is something that we've been asking for a really long time, right? If Zwift or MyWish or platform, whatever, is a cycling esports platform, then they should be elevating their stars, right? And this is a way for them to elevate their stars. There's a pathway there for you to earn this recognition and to maintain this recognition, and for other riders that are riding with you in the community can then look to you as one of the elite racers, and it elevates you, it elevates the sport, it allows everybody to kind of have a vested interest in what's going on. It's a significant change, and a significant change in philosophy also. And I think it's, of everything that we've spoken about, I think that's one of the most impactful things that we've seen come out of this race book.
Well, you wait for all those questions when our elite racers, with the ticks, the verifications next to their name, when the next time they're on, that chat is going to go nuts in terms of picking their brains about what is happening, because everybody will know it is indeed them. Well, the schedule, the first Zwift World Series race, that first community qualifier, kicks off on September the 5th. Which is an interesting timing for the schedule, because that is, of course, the day before the World Championship semi-final on September the 6th. Interesting start date.
I'm sure it's just a coincidence, Emma. I'm sure that they probably didn't even know that the semifinal was the day after.
Well, it is about, I think it's going to be about choosing what you do, isn't it? And it's going to be interesting to see who makes the choice to enter that qualification round for the first event and who waits till the second.
It is interesting. And, it's, I guess, as far as business wise, if you can debate as to whether it's a great move, or if you look at it from our perspective, we are looking at the bigger picture, of an international calendar, the ranking system. We want the platforms to cooperate. And would we like to see a little bit more coordination here? Certainly we would. But I can also see why each of the platforms would want to make a splash here individually. But hopefully that'll change in the future. But it definitely seems really exciting.
It does, and I do think it is something for those riders and racers who are not selected by their countries to take part in the World Championships. It does give them something else that they can focus on and jump onto very quickly.
Absolutely, and that'll just the beginning of it. That's the first race, and they have a long season to look forward to then.
Well, talking about the World Championships on my whoosh, Chris, I think we couldn't possibly go without mentioning the new Flamme Rouge Racing trial event for the World Championships, which is going to be taking place, well, two events taking place on the 26th of June. So coming up pretty quickly, 10 o'clock UTC and 6 p.m. UTC. The opportunity to try out the 3 World Championship courses back to back. Doesn't matter whether you are potentially going to be selected for the World Championships or you are any rider who wants to jump on and have a go. The opportunity is going to be there on the 26th of June to do so, which is a really exciting thing to happen.
Absolutely. I actually put out an announcement which has the spreadsheet, so that you sign up for that on the Zimmunique if you'd like to do that. And I also spoke to Richard, and I believe he's going to be adding one further time slot for people in the U.S. time zone that weren't able to get to it during the times that were previously scheduled. So I think he is going to be adding one more scheduled time as well. So that is really interesting. It is, and it's a great opportunity for the people over at Flamme Rouge and everybody who wants to actually get a look at those courses and formats.
Well, I think, anybody can jump on, anyone can have a go. You do just need to sign up and you will know exactly what the riders have to do for that World Championships in October. You'll have ridden it before them, you'll have had a go and you'll know exactly what they're undertaking. Well, I can tell you currently, as of 12:30 Central European time today, 109 riders had signed up for that event.
I think it's pretty cool. I really do.
Yeah, I think we may be seeing a fair few more riders signing up for it by the time we get to the 26th of June, but I may indeed be one.
I'll make sure that I do link that article in the notes here, so there'll be access to that spreadsheet if you want to take part in that as well.
Yeah. The other thing from my wish have been a little bit out on social media this week. Teasing everybody about a new rider coming on board. Do you know anything about that, Chris?
I don't know. It's just one of these like worst kept secrets type of things, because I'm the worst when it comes to any kind of riddles or trivia, and even I was able to figure this one out, Emma. So I think if you're paying attention, you know who it's going to be. And then the question is, how are they going to utilize this very flamboyant, charismatic racer who's really, a living legend, right? How are they going to utilize him? I was joking with Sai, because Sai is in charge of the video on demand at MyWish now. And I said, are you going to be this person's boss now? Are you going to be the one that has to tell them when to show up for a video on demand workout? And if this person does, I think that I will show up for a video on demand workout.
I'll tell you something. There's been a lot of people guessing and trying to work out who it is. And if you are possibly correct, Chris, and the video on demand, I think there will be an awful lot of people there for a little bit of live coaching from said individual. Well, I can neither confirm nor deny because I have no idea who it is. Well, whilst we're talking about MyWhoosh and we're talking about Zwift, one of the things we do want to do is take just a moment and an opportunity, because our thoughts are currently with Zoe Langham and Adam Thorpe, who were guests on the Virtual Velo podcast for episode 21. Adam has recently been involved in quite a terrible accident over the last week with the driver of a van whilst on his bike. All our love and support is being sent to them both at this time, and I'm sure the community is just as behind them as we are.
My best to Zoe and Adam. It's certainly, I know how it's been an emotional time for her, and all I can say is all the best, all my strength goes to them both.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people sending that strength, love and support to them as well. Well, that leaves me to say thank you to our guest, Dr. Andrew Richardson. If you have enjoyed today's podcast and you want to know more, you can follow, you can like, and you can subscribe to the Zmunica. You can follow myself, Emma Martin, at Biking Emma on Instagram, or you can follow me at Full Speed Events. We will be back with you shortly for episode 45 of the Virtual Velo Podcast. Until then, stay safe and enjoy your riding. Goodbye.